Thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I've been here a few times before, and I'm really honored to be invited back. Just a quick little announcement from British Columbia, from working people there. We are working very, very hard in the next week, and we've been working for months to make sure a week this Tuesday, Rachel has another NDP government to talk to in Canada. And a government, by the way, committed to making sure it's going to be $15 an hour in British Columbia and Alberta, which would be a great step forward for people. Listen, I'm going to use a slideshow here. It's only the first time at this, so give me a try at this. You learn a lot of things when you retire. Most of the stuff I'm going to talk about is in New Code for New Times, which is a section of your submission that I worked on for the Federation. A couple of things to start with, really two things. We have a serious challenge for the labour movement, obviously, with precarious work, etc., but we also have some serious solutions that require some bold action to get to it. I think you've heard today, and you just heard it again, boy, are we important to the world of working people. I mean, think about unions and how important we are and what we do. It's not just about a paycheck. It's not just about a contract. It's about a kind of society and a place we live in. And that's so important. And when I was looking around for support of that as the Fed president, I found some fascinating support for that concept from an unusual person. Now, I'm not very religious, but I think I started quoting the Pope about 2 years ago. He said something important. He said, trade unions have been essential force for social change, without which a semblance of a decent and humane society is impossible under capitalism. Think about what he just said. He said, basically, we're responsible for making a decent life under the system we live with. That's a pretty big responsibility. Now, I thought I should balance this, since I'm an old journalist like Gil there, with looking at who's the most famous union buster that I know of. And so I thought, it turns out the most famous union buster is the most well-known politician in the world, his picture. And that's Adolf. Because he said we must close union offices, confiscate their money, and put their leaders in prison. All of which he did. And to the point about the Wagner, it's about fascism, folks. And the people that really don't want unions are also people that don't want democracy and don't want rights for people either. They're not interested in any of that. You see, because it turns out that working people are always on the wrong side of the balance sheet and definitely not the kind of people they want to hang out with. But it's really what they hate is not just working people, they hate working people with power. And that's the truth. So let me tell you something different than David's presentation today. All those people there don't look like our friends, but sometimes they are. And they're the Supreme Court Justices of Canada. And thanks to a huge fight by healthcare workers that set this in motion in 2002, who went to court after their contracts were ripped up by a government, this court in particular decided that actually belonging to a union was a fundamental constitutional right, and constitutional rights just weren't individual, they were collective. And I think it's worth repeating what they said because it's profound. By banding together in the pursuit of common goals, individuals are able to prevent more powerful entities from thwarting their legitimate goals and desires. In this way, the guarantee of freedom of association empowers vulnerable groups and helps them to work to right imbalances in society. It protects marginalized groups and makes possible a more equal society. Well, let me tell you, there are millions of workers in this country that affects, and they don't have the right to join a union today, and that's one of our challenges we have to face. And we call them loosely precarious workers. Low wages, contract jobs, temporary jobs, part-time jobs, no benefits, non-union, the list goes on. How many people in this room know somebody in Alberta that has one of those jobs? Put their hands up. Exactly. We all know people in these jobs because these jobs are everywhere. Now in Alberta, I'll go through that very quickly, 300,000 of Albertans are low-wage workers. They make $15 or less. 183,000 of those are women, and 115,000 are young workers. The majority of them don't live at home. It is an absolute myth that these are folks making money to go out and party on Friday night. And besides, I don't think there's anything wrong with a student getting $15 who's paying $8,000 to go to school for tuition. Okay, so the trend, 22,000 Albertans have temporary jobs. Now, it is true that some people have temporary jobs because they want them. But at least 25 to 30% in all the studies don't want them. And that's gone up 23% in the last decades. That's not a good trend, frankly, because on the other side of that trend is full-time jobs. And full-time work has plummeted by 21% for young people in the last 40 years. So the chances of getting a full-time job for a young person has gone down almost 50%. In Alberta, more than 400,000 workers are employed part-time in Alberta. And in the past 2 years, Alberta shed more than 110,000 full-time jobs, but saw an increase of more than 70,000 part-time jobs. Now, you're not special here. You've had tough economic times, but that trend has gone across the entire country and across North America, and frankly, the developed world. I always like to get a good left-wing source to support my positions, so I thought I'd use the CIBC in this case, who has done a major study on precarious work and decided something we all have to understand is we observe a slow but steady deterioration in working conditions across the country. They also suggest that this has gone down because of the number of part-time jobs, because after recessions, when jobs go down, full-time jobs, they don't come back at the same rate as part-time work. So this is a train wreck for us as working-class people in terms of the direction we're going. I like this quote because I think it helped to really lay out some thoughts here, because it's a young worker who's been out there trying to organize young workers in the precarious work sectors. He said, "I'm concerned about the direction that Canada is heading. So many people my age are struggling for jobs, working contract to contract, and that won't change until the rebirth of the labor movement." Those are fairly important words. The State of the Union movement. Now, that's the canary. And the canary's dead. But we aren't. But I wanted to use that image because the canary is dead. We have deep problems. And I think you heard some of them this morning. So the density drop, and there's really two stories to tell here, but they're actually one. There's private sector and public sector. So let me talk about the private sector first. Density has dropped nationally from 21% to 16% between 1997 and 2015, a 25% drop in density. Numbers dropped from 1.8 million in 2002 to 1.7 million in 2015. This is really important because really no longer are we chasing density up. In other words, we're still growing in the private sector, which is not growing fast enough to keep density. We are now losing real numbers, real income, real members, so that we're now on the US scale right now. In the last 5 years, this has happened. We're on the US scale where we're losing real members. We are actually shrinking. And you can see there, the charts beside it, the top one is male employment. That's really gone down dramatically. Women's work, women union members has actually gone up. And that's directly attributable to the public sector and to the healthcare sector, where those sectors have grown because of the increase in healthcare workers and the numbers hired there. Now, public sector density, highest in North America. We are in good shape in the public sector right now. We're better, we're almost double. The best states and the best numbers in the states are New York and California and I think Illinois. They have the highest. They're about 45% public sector density. We're almost double that. And we're that across the board in almost every province and nationally. So it's gone up in the last 5 years, and the numbers have gone up the same period. We went up by 800,000 members in the public sector. So we now have 2.6 million members in that sector. Okay, so let's go back home, come back home to Alberta. Density dropped from 14% in 1997 to 10.8% in 2015, lowest in Canada. So that's where we're at today. Today, there are 163,000 private sector workers are in unions in I know where I am, in Alberta. And precarious workers in Alberta in the retail sector, the accommodation sector, in the other services sector, they're the lowest density in Canada as well. The public sector density has been stable at 70%. You have 289,000 union members who work there. Private sector headed for the bottom if we keep going in this direction. This is supposed to be my scary slide, okay? And it is scary to me. It scares the hell out of me, frankly. If we keep going and they don't do any of the awful things to us that they might do, our density will drop to 10.4% nationally in the next 10 to 15 years at the present rates of deunionization. The number of private sector union members will drop by more than 300,000. The Alberta density for the private sector will drop to 7.6% on par with US levels. So that will take place. If nothing changes now and we keep doing exactly what we're doing and the laws stay the same, we don't get anti-union laws, then that's the direction we're going at this point. And if you're sitting there in the public sector and feeling pretty good about yourselves after that, don't be. Because you are in just as much danger as the private sector, and it can happen far more quickly for you. We are vulnerable in the public sector to a great deal of legislation, and a decline in private sector clears the way for that. Let's be clear, we stand on 2 feet, and when that one private sector gets weaker and weaker, then the other one becomes more untenable. And you've heard the attack, divide and conquer between private and public sector workers. Wisconsin was a perfect example you heard about this morning. I'm just going to reiterate that. AFSCME, which is the big public sector union, lost 70% of its members in 2 years. 70% of the members in 2 years because the government brought in massive legislation, as you heard, to take that away. But don't forget, they didn't stop there. The whole union movement lost 50% of its membership, and they brought in right-to-work legislation later to make sure they finish off the private sector at the same time. So they don't love public sector workers or love private sector workers. They don't like any of us and would like us all to go away. Legislation crucial to, okay, this is one of the most important slides for the next 5. Because there's a reason why we have a union movement, and one of those reasons is not just the sweat struggle of everybody here. It's because we had legislation that made it possible. So in 1935, they passed the Wagner Act. That brought in the right to organize. Until that time, you didn't have a right to organize, and the company didn't have to recognize you. There was the fastest growing period. I was talking to David afterwards, and it was the fastest growing period of unionization in the entire United States history. And for 10 years, they more than doubled their membership in the private sector. 4.5 million members joined. They also changed their organizing. They changed their labor movement to take advantage of that change, and they created the industrial unions. In 1944, we passed PC 103 in Canada. Density went from 16.3% to 33.7% in a decade. So there was a massive increase. I want to say again, it's all about politics. They passed that law 103 because the CCF was winning in the polls federally, and the labor minister at the time said, the Liberal labor minister said, thank God we've passed PC 103. That's going to do a lot for workers to organize. I think he really believed that. But he said it's also going to help undercut the CCF because this is based on what the CCF did in Saskatchewan in 1944. So let's be clear, whatever we get in the labor code has to do with politics and the political pressure of the labor movement to put that on, and it was true then. 1944 in the public sector, the CCF gave public sector to the workers the right to organize in Saskatchewan 25 years ahead of everybody else in the country. That was, again, politics. 1968 to 72, the federal and provincial governments legislated unionization for the public sector. 250,000 workers joined unions. In Alberta, 30,000 public sector workers were unionized in 1968. I'm going to move through this fairly quickly because I'm running out of time, but the right wing made organizing so difficult. Well, they did a lot of things, but they took away some basic stuff. Card check, not because we want to make it a secret joining the union, it's because we want to organize unions without the boss finding and threatening people, firing them, and intimidating them. Let's be clear, that's the issue here. They removed restrictions, freedom of speech, not for the workers, but for the employers now. That's exactly what they have. So they threaten workers. And the first contract legislation is terrible in most places in the country. How important are those changes? They're very important. As Stats Canada's report found that instead of losing the density we've lost, we would have picked up 4%. We would have had 4% gain in density during the last period if we'd had card check across the country. Systematically, the right wing has removed card check in every province but 2, and federally they were on their way to removing it. But that's not just it's not just the labor code. Organizing becomes a risk, not a right. No movement can survive unless it's a right to be joining it. And if it's a risk to join your movement, that's a lot to ask somebody. And if the risk is to lose their job, that's a hell of a lot. The growth of the service sector and the low-wage non-union, obviously that's a problem. Free trade and decline of manufacturing jobs, a huge problem. We lost so many members, 250,000 members in manufacturing. To the point of the brothers and sisters from construction, double-breasting, contracting out, those were all factors. And also, we're not organizing like we used to. We're not spending money in the union movement to do the organization. So what do we do about it? Well, I think that really we need to find a new way to organize and a new change. We need to look at those, at the situation we're in right now as workers did in 1935 and 1944 and in the 1970s in the public sector. That we need to make a bold move to change the labor codes so that we can actually go back to organizing. Last year in Alberta, only less than 1,000 workers were organized into your movement. You can't continue to grow or to survive at that kind of rate of organization. Half of them were in long-term care facilities. So what do we get to? Well, we get to sectoral bargaining, which is this fancy word. What it really means is that Under the present rules, we can't organize workers in small workplaces, let's be honest. We can't service them, we can't organize them, and we can't keep them in the union. And turnovers are high. And that's a significant problem for us, so there are ways to figure this out. The Labour Code has to change to allow for new forms of collective bargaining and organization. The quote from the interim report in Ontario said it all. It is said the Wagner Act model limits access to collective bargaining to many thousands of workers because there's no practical way for collective bargaining to operate. This is seen to affect vulnerable workers in precarious work. Very clearly, the system doesn't work for us or those workers. What this means is you can, a good example, the BC model we talk about, there's 8 gas stations in a town. You organize 2 of them, and automatically the other 8 that you organize become a member of that collective bargaining process, and you don't have to negotiate 10 collective agreements for 10 gas stations in that town. You can organize 1 for all 10. That makes sense. And it's the only way those people are going to get a union, I'm afraid. Multi-union councils like they have in Quebec was mentioned earlier. You have sectoral councils representing all the unions in that sector. They negotiate with the employers. They set minimum standards for the whole place and raise everybody's standards. Again, it's been done before. It's done in Quebec. It can be done. The European model, won't spend a lot of time on that, except that they negotiate the contracts for everybody. You may not be a union member, but you're under a union contract almost in every country where you work. And those models can work, and that's the boldness. It's not just the little piecemeal changes we need. We need sectoral bargaining so you can go out there and do your job, organize workers, bring them in, and negotiate collective agreements so they have rights. That's their solution, and we got to be able to deliver it to them. And to do that, we have to change the code. If we keep going where we're doing, I'm not going to waste time on that. You know where that goes. What do we need to get there? Well, United Labour Movement starts, helps. We need to have one voice on the Labour Code. We need to be clear what we need, and we need to go and ask for that. Somebody said, I think Madeline said this morning, the speaker, that it's about political action. It is. It's about working with our allies in the communities and building that support to do that and giving voice to that. It's about representing precarious workers. Those people who earn low wages are told by their bosses and are told by their right-wing media that the reason they get low wages is because of you. It's your fault that they get low wages and they don't have a pension. And why should they pay for your pension and wages when they don't have it? And if they don't see us out there defending them, they see us as a job trust supporting a bunch of people who get paid too much money. They have to see us as advocates. And when you fight for the minimum wage and you win that fight and they raise the minimum wage, they see us as their allies, not their enemies. And I just want to end with back to the point about the bold, big stuff again. Martin Luther King said this: "The labor movement was the principal force that transformed misery and despair into hope and progress. Out of its bold struggles, economic and social reform gave birth to unemployment insurance, old age pensions, government relief for the destitute, and above all, new wage levels that meant not mere survival, but a tolerable life. When in the 30s, the wave of union organization crested over the nation, it carried to secure shores not only itself, but the whole society. Sisters and brothers, that's our job. I think our moment has come to move forward. You have that moment in this province. Let's go and do it. Thank you for everything you do every day, and thank you for this chance."